He felt it and knew it, and I read the knowledge in his eyes. I stepped up to Rudolf Rassendyll. He heard or felt me, and turned his eyes for an instant. I do not know what my face said, but he shook his head and turned back to Rupert. The revolver, held still in the man's own hand, was at his heart. The motion ceased. The point was reached. I looked again at Rupert. Now his face was easier. There was a slight smile on his lips. He flung back his comely head and rested thus against the wainscoting. His eyes asked a question of Rudolf Rassendyll. I turned my gaze to where the answer was to come, for Rudolf made none in words. By the swiftest of movements he shifted his grasp from Rupert's wrist and pounced on his hand. Now his forefinger rested on Rupert's, and Rupert's was on the trigger. I am no soft heart, but I laid a hand on his shoulder. He took no heed. I dared do no more. Rupert glanced at me. I caught his look, but what could I say to him? Again my eyes were riveted on Rudolf's finger. Now it was crooked round Rupert's, seeming like a man who strangles another. I will not say more. He smiled to the last. His proud head, which had never bent for shame, did not bend for fear. There was a sudden tightening in the pressure of that crooked forefinger, a flash, a noise. He was held up against the wall for an instant by Rudolf's hand. When that was removed he sank, a heap that looked all head and knees. But hot on the sound of the discharge came a shout and an oath from Bernenstein. He was hurled away from the door, and through it burst Rischenheim and the whole score after him. They were jostling one another and crying out to know what passed and where the king was. High over the voices, coming from the back of the throng, I heard the cry of the girl Rosa. But as soon as they were in the room, the same spell that had fastened Bernenstein and me to inactivity imposed its numbing power on them also. Only Rischenheim gave a sudden sob and ran forward to where his cousin lay. The rest stood staring. For a moment Rudolf eyed them. Then, without a word, he turned his back. He put out the right hand with which he had just killed Rupert of Hentzau, and took the letter from the mantelpiece. He glanced at the envelope, then he opened the letter. The handwriting banished any last doubt he had. He tore the letter across and again in 4 pieces, and yet again in smaller fragments. Then he sprinkled the morsels of paper into the blaze of the fire. I believe that every eye in the room followed them and watched till they curled and crinkled into black, wafery ashes. Thus, at last, the Queen's letter was safe. When he had thus set the seal on his task, he turned round to us again. He paid no heed to Rischenheim, who was crouching down by the body of Rupert, but he looked at Bernenstein and me, and then at the people behind us. He waited a moment before he spoke. Then his utterance was not only calm, but also very slow, so that he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Gentlemen," said he, "a full account of this matter will be rendered by myself in due time. For the present, it must suffice to say that this gentleman who lies here dead sought an interview with me on private business. I came here to find him, desiring, as he professed to desire, privacy, and here he tried to kill me. The result of his attempt you see." I bowed low. Bernenstein did the like, and all the rest followed our example. "A full account shall be given," said Rudolf. "Now all leave me, except the Count of Tarlenheim and Lieutenant von Bernenstein." Most unwillingly, with gaping mouths and wonder-struck eyes, the throng filed out of the door. Rischenheim rose to his feet. "You stay, if you like," said Rudolf, and the count knelt again by his kinsman. Seeing the rough bedsteads by the wall of the attic, I touched Rischenheim on the shoulder and pointed to one of them. Together we lifted Rupert of Hentzau. The revolver was still in his hand, but Bernenstein disengaged it from his grasp. Then Rischenheim and I laid him down, disposing his body decently, and spreading over it his riding cloak, still spotted with the mud gathered on his midnight expedition to the hunting lodge. His face looked much as before the shot was fired. In death as in life he was the handsomest fellow in all Ruritania. I wager that many tender hearts ached and many bright eyes were dimmed for him when the news of his guilt and death went forth. There are ladies still in Strelsau who wear his trinkets in an ashamed devotion that cannot forget. Well, even I, who had every cause to hate and scorn him, set the hair smooth on his brow, while Rischenheim was sobbing like a child, and young Bernenstein rested his head on his arm as he leant on the mantelpiece, and would not look at the dead. Rudolf alone seemed not to heed him or think of him. His eyes had lost their unnatural look of joy, and were now calm and tranquil. He took his own revolver from the mantelpiece and put it in his pocket, laying Rupert's neatly where his had been. Then he turned to me and said, "Come, let us go to the Queen and tell her that the letter is beyond reach of hurt." Moved by some impulse, I walked to the window and put my head out. I was seen from below, and a great shout greeted me. The crowd before the doors grew every moment. The people, flocking from all quarters, would soon multiply it 100-fold, for such news as had been carried from the attic by 20 wandering tongues spread like a forest fire. It would be through Strelsau in a few minutes, through the kingdom in an hour, through Europe in but little longer. Rupert was dead, and the letter was safe. But what were we to tell that great concourse concerning their king? A queer feeling of helpless perplexity came over me, and found vent in a foolish laugh. Bernenstein was by my side. He also looked out and turned again with an eager face. "You'll have a royal progress to your palace," said he to Rudolf Rassendyll. Mr. Rassendyll made no answer, but coming to me took my arm. We went out, leaving Rischenheim by the body. I did not think of him. Bernenstein probably thought that he would keep his pledge given to the Queen, for he followed us immediately and without demur. There was nobody outside the door. The house was very quiet, and the tumult from the street reached us only in a muffled roar. But when we came to the foot of the stairs, we found the two women. Mother Holf stood on the threshold of the kitchen, looking amazed and terrified. Rosa was clinging to her, but as soon as Rudolf came in sight, the girl sprang forward and flung herself on her knees before him, pouring out incoherent thanks to Heaven for his safety. He bent down and spoke to her in a whisper. She looked up with a flush of pride on her face. He seemed to hesitate a moment. He glanced at his hands, but he wore no ring save that which the Queen had given him long ago. Then he disengaged his chain and took his gold watch from his pocket. Turning it over, he showed me the monogram, R.R. "Rudolphus Rex," he whispered with a whimsical smile, and pressed the watch into the girl's hand, saying, "Keep this to remind you of me." She laughed and sobbed as she caught it with one hand, while with the other she held his. "You must let go," he said gently. "I have much to do." I took her by the arm and induced her to rise. Rudolf, released, passed on to where the old woman stood. He spoke to her in a stern, distinct voice. "I don't know," he said, "how far you are a party to the plot that was hatched in your house. For the present I am content not to know, for it is no pleasure to me to detect disloyalty or to punish an old woman. But take care. The first word you speak, the first act you do against me, the king, will bring its certain and swift punishment. If you trouble me, I won't spare you. In spite of traitors, I am still king in Strelsau." He paused, looking hard in her face. Her lip quivered and her eyes fell. "Yes," he repeated, "I am king in Strelsau. Keep your hands out of mischief and your tongue quiet." She made no answer. He passed on. I was following, but as I went by her the old woman clutched my arm. "In God's name, who is he?" she whispered. "Are you mad?" I asked, lifting my brows. "Don't you know the king when he speaks to you? And you'd best remember what he said. He has servants who'll do his orders." She let me go and fell back a step. Young Bernenstein smiled at her. He at least found more pleasure than anxiety in our position. Thus, then, we left them, the old woman terrified, amazed, doubtful, the girl with ruddy